Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar focused on cost optimization with AWS. My name's Caroline Iam. I will be leading the session today, and I work in the customer enablement team across ASEAN. So before we get started, just a few things about what to expect from today's session. Today we'll go for approximately 1 hour, which will be comprised of 50 minutes of content and then 10 minutes of Q&A at the end. But actually, we are fortunate enough to also have cost optimization experts online throughout the webinar. So if at any point you have a question about the content that you would like answered, or perhaps you have a cost optimization question that you want to get answered now, please feel free to drop that question into the questions box and a cost optimization expert will respond to you straight away. I will then be available at the end in case you have any questions for me. So what are we going to talk about today? We want to make this quite a specific session. So I'm going to cover two things in a little bit of detail. You can expect a combination of theory as well as a demonstration of what this looks like in the management console. So firstly, we're going to cover some of the AWS cost management tooling available to you for free today. So we'll talk about AWS Budgets and we'll also talk about Cost Explorer. Then the next topic that we'll go into in some detail is how to understand and leverage the right pricing model to help you reduce cost. So we'll talk about when reserved instances are the most appropriate pricing model and how you can start using Spot as well, which offers up to 90% discount compared to on-demand pricing. So let's start with AWS Budgets. When we speak to customers, quite a lot of the feedback that we hear is customers have different budgets for either projects or lines of business. They might be monthly, they might be quarterly, but they're not sure about how to be proactively informed of when their AWS spend is approaching that budget limit. So earlier this year, we introduced AWS Budgets, which lets customers go into the console and set up a budget type specific to their needs. So I'm just sharing a screenshot at the moment of what this looks like. You can see that you've got all of your projects running down the side next to budget names. There are different types of budgets you can set up. So cost budgets, usage budgets, you can set up reserved instance budgets, and then the details of how much your spend is currently, what the budgeted amount was, and really where you are tracking versus budget and versus forecast. So let's jump into the console now to see how we can set one of these up. Now today I will be doing the demonstration from my AWS account. I use this as a demonstration account. So just be mindful when you're looking at some of the numbers in there, this is not necessarily indicative of how an actual account would work. But let's start at the billing and cost management dashboard page. To go to budgets, I simply scroll over to the left, look for budgets down the left-hand side, and I can click in. And you can see that it brings up the budgets that I have here. So you can see I've got a test budget, a monthly report, utilization report, and this gives me a very quick visual overview of where my budget is compared to where I think it should be. Now I'm going to step through how we create a new budget. And it's a relatively straightforward process. So I simply click on Create Budget, and it gives me some choices. So I can monitor against spend. Maybe I think about my environment in terms of how many instances I use or how much storage I'm using. So I could do it by usage. And of course, if I wanted to track my utilization or RI coverage, I could do a reservation budget. But let's take a look at cost budget first. So the first step is to set your budget. And you have to fill out a few details. So I'm going to do a budget this time on Elasticsearch. You then get the option to choose what type of period. Are we thinking it's going to be a monthly budget, a quarterly budget? Maybe it's an annual budget. I'm going to go with monthly. And I'm going to leave this budgeted amount blank for the moment. But you can see that the default is to give you a prompt at how much this account spent last month for all of your usage. So in my demo account, you can see I'm almost spending $4,000. So I keep on scrolling, and because I said that actually I want this to be a particular budget, I can start to build the filters to make that budget happen. So I want to filter by service here, and I can simply type in the first few letters of the service I want to filter by, and I can apply that filter. Now you can see that the chart on the right has updated to give me a visual of how much this service has been incurring for the last 12 months. I could take this further if I wanted to. If I wanted to get very specific about linked account, about tag, about instance type, I could further refine that budget. So for example, say I'm only caring about my M4 large Elasticsearch instance, I can adjust that as well. So now I can see, okay, this is how my spend is tracking. I can now start to set potentially a better budget amount with respect to how that account's been tracking. And you can see that this amount now has updated to reflect the last month cost of the services that we actually wanted to track. So let's say I want to spend no more than $500 on Elasticsearch going forward. So I can scroll to the bottom, and this lets me then configure alerts. So we hear from customers quite a lot that not all of you come to the management console all the time. So you actually want to be proactively alerted. And this lets you do that. So you can set a couple of different types of alerts. You can send an alert based on your actual costs or your forecasted costs, and I'm going to do both. So say I want to know when my actual costs exceed 50% of my budgeted amount. So I can actually go in and take a look and take action. And I want this to be emailed to me because I don't come into the management console all that time, or potentially somebody else in my team manages the Elasticsearch spend and I want them to take ownership for it. So I can simply plug in the email, and if I wanted to add another email contact, I could do that. And if I wanted to actually send this as an SNS topic, I could do that as well. But I also said I wanted to know forecast costs too. So I personally think that forecast costs are more helpful than actual costs, because if I start spending too much against my budget very early in the month, it will extrapolate that for me and it will send it to me. So I might say I want to know when my forecast cost exceeds 75% of my budgeted amount, and I'm again going to send that to my email, and then I'm going to confirm the budget. And here you can see it just gives me a summary of what's going on. So my budget name, the period, the budgeted amount, the alert, who it's going to, and then I can click Create. And you can see that that has now created a new budget called My Elasticsearch Budget. Now, I just want to show one more budget because we get this question a lot as well. We get asked, how do I know if my RI utilization is below the threshold that I expect? So you can see, you can click in here and the user interface is quite similar. I'm going to call this my EC2 RI utilization. Again, you can choose the period to look at. I actually want to know about my utilization on a daily basis if there are any unexpected changes. You can also look at coverage, but let's look at utilization. And you can choose. So you can see it will only give you the options for which you have active reserved instances. And then you get to put in your utilization threshold. So you can see this pops up with my last day's utilization was 4.3%. As I said earlier, this is a test. This is my test and demo account. So my utilization is very low on all of them. So say I want to know when it drops below 50%. And again, it gives you a chart which shows you how your utilization has been tracking, and you can filter it to make it more specific by instance, by region, by platform, and so on. And in much the same way, you can select how that notification goes to you, and off you go. So budgets are a really fantastic way to start to better get organizational alignment on what a project or service budget is. And it also allows for proactive alerting, which can really help alert your users very early if there is an unexpected change or an unexpected deviation in how much money you're spending for a very specific service or a specific set of services. So the other quite cool thing that you can do, and please reach out if anybody is interested in this, is we looked briefly at the ability to tick a box saying I want this to go to an SNS topic. And that creates just a world of opportunities. So you can link that SNS topic into triggering a Lambda function, and that Lambda function can do things like restrict the instances that your users can spin up if your budget is exceeded. So a common use case that we see is for people looking at test and dev accounts. They might want their developers to have the flexibility to experiment, but only up to a certain cost limit. So you might set up a budget which says, send an SNS notification when this particular group spend is forecast to exceed $500. If that notification is triggered, a Lambda function is triggered, which essentially goes and changes the test and dev user permissions from full EC2 read and write access to read only. So a really, really wonderful way to have serverless cost control within guidelines. So control with flexibility. So the next topic that I would like to cover is on Cost Explorer. So Cost Explorer is our cost management tool. You can see here how you go and set it up. If you haven't enabled it, you simply go to your billing dashboard, click on the Cost Explorer link, and it will prompt you to enable Cost Explorer. The data does take between 24 to 48 hours to populate, and once populated, it will give you details of the last 13 months of your spend. So Cost Explorer lets you understand the drivers of your costs and lets you cut that data in a number of different ways in a way which is very visually sort of appealing and visually easy to understand. So let's take a look at what Cost Explorer looks like. So before we get into the console, I just wanted to explain here some of the key features that you'll see on each page. So the basic premise of Cost Explorer is you can edit your time frame. So you can go back 12 months plus the current month of spend. You can edit the time period. So you can look at your costs on either a daily or a monthly basis. You can do a number of different group buys to give you different stacks, as you can see below, depending on the view that's relevant to you. And then, of course, you can apply filters in much of the same way as we saw with budgets to get this view to be really, really relevant and customized to the cost that you're trying to understand. And then all of these reports, once you go through the process of filtering, can be saved. So the next time you come back to your Cost Explorer, you can automatically recall this view without having to go through the customizations again. And if your organization is an organization that still is typically working in Excel, or maybe you're using tools such as Tableau, all of these reports can be downloaded into CSV to help you do further analysis as required. So let's take a look at what this looks like in the console. So I'm back in the console and I'm going to my Cost Explorer. And for those of you that haven't logged into Cost Explorer for a while, you might notice that actually the user interface looks a little bit different from what you might remember. So I'm also going to touch on some of the enhancements that Cost Explorer has gone through in the last 2 weeks. So now when I'm at the home page on my Cost Explorer, you can see it gives me a summary of my month-to-date costs. It tells me how do my month-to-date costs compare to where they were last month, and then what are my forecasted month-end costs, and how does that compare to last month? So you can get a very quick snapshot of how your costs are trending. And then below, you can see a chart of your daily unblended costs. And down the side, and I find this incredibly useful, it pulls out the top changes in your account month on month. So for me, you can see my EC2 costs have gone up 54%. My T3 large costs have gone up 304%, and my C5 large costs have gone up as well. So if you're running a multi-account structure, this will also let you know which account in your group of accounts has had the biggest increase in costs. Now, this is really, really helpful if you're running lots of accounts and maybe you've got a few smaller accounts that you don't normally look at. If you see any of them have a significant either dollar or percentage increase, it will pop up here. And you can also see about cost by region. So if you have any regions which are suddenly increasing in cost, it will pull that out. And it will finally tell you about reserved instance information. So if you have any reserved instances expiring, it will give you that information. It will also share how much you've saved from your RI strategy if you'd made additional purchases. And you can see all of these are hyperlinks. If you click on them, they'll give you more information. So this is a new feature which has really recently been released. And down the bottom, you can see there's links to some common reports which you might find helpful. So what else does this tool do? So I can click on Explore, and if I click on Explore, you can see it offers me 3 different tabs. So I can go to cost and usage, and for those people who are used to what Cost Explorer looks like, this might be more familiar to you. So it brings you back to your total cost by service. And again, you can do some of the manipulations that we spoke about earlier. But this is a pretty helpful view when you're trying to think about where to start cost optimizing. We often hear customers say, look, I want to start optimizing my cost, but where to go to first? You know, I might be running lots of accounts or using lots of different services. But this view very simply shows you, okay, for my account, EC2 instances are driving the majority of my cost, followed by Elasticsearch, followed by RDS. So if I'm going to do only one thing in my account, I'm going to be looking at EC2. If I was going to be taking a few actions, you know, maybe I would start looking at my next most significant costs. So this can be a great view to start helping to direct your attentions to help you tackle like one service at a time rather than trying to do everything at once. Now for a lot of customers, EC2 and RDS are still the biggest spend items. So it's a really good idea to understand what is it in your EC2 environment that's driving your cost. So you can see here, this is showing, let's just look at my last 3 months of spend. So I can change that filter. And let's actually look at it on a daily basis. So you can see here for me, I wasn't really using very much. And then all of a sudden in September, my usage has popped up. You can see my daily costs, as well as the hours I've been using. So the default view for all of Cost Explorer is it's showing you your actual cash costs. So we talked about the group by function, and you can change the view by simply clicking on the top. So if I click service, I'm looking at EC2, so I can just see my EC2. If I look at instance type, which is quite a helpful view, it will show me the instances that I'm using in my account. So you can see I'm using a little bit of C518 extra large. It's a big instance. It's driving quite a bit of cost. If I want to know, well, why has there been this sudden drop off in my spend, despite the fact that my usage has continued, there's a few other quite useful group bys and filters that I can put on. So maybe I want to know, well, what have I been doing? Have I been using reserved instances or spot? So I can group by purchase option. It can be a little bit slow, and you can see actually, you know, a lot of this was spot, and then I've got a little bit of on demand, but it's really spot and reserved instances which I'm using in my account. And if I want to understand, well, how does that look like on a P&L view? Like if I paid all up front for my reserved instances, but I want to actually understand what does that cost look like if it was amortized, I can also show costs as an amortized view. And you can see for me, like there's a little bit of upfront RIs there, so a little bit of cost associated with that. We will come back to the other reports later when we go into reserved instances in a bit more detail, but the other really helpful tab is the reservation summary. So this tab shows you how many reserved instances do you have. Because this is a demo account, I have lots of reserved instances. I demonstrate how to purchase them to customers all the time. I don't actually use them. So you can see for me, I have a negative net savings in the last 30 days. For most customers, this is a positive number, and it will show me my reservations expiring in the next 30 days. And then it's a really simple view of showing you for the reserved instances that you have or where you're using a service, what's your RI coverage, and how much more could you save if you introduced reserved instances into your environment. But like I said, we'll jump into that in a bit more detail when we come back to reserved instances. So if you haven't had a look at the new Cost Explorer, definitely worthwhile taking a look. We speak to customers who have sort of been trying to manage their environment without a robust understanding of cost drivers. And once they start to set up a few customized reports in Cost Explorer, they're actually able to take much better ownership of their environment. So the next topic that I wanted to talk about was what pricing models are available in AWS. So the default pricing model that our customers start on is on demand. So on demand, you pay for what you use, you can turn it on and off as you please. So it's a very, very flexible, easy to use pricing model. But as customers get more advanced on the platform and as they start to look for additional ways to save, there are two pricing models which really jump out as an awesome savings opportunity. And those are reserved instances and spot instances. So a quick overview of each. Reserved instances are available for EC2, RDS, Redshift, Elasticsearch, Elasticache, and DynamoDB, so a lot of services. The ideal workload for a reserved instance is your steady state, always on workload. So if you're running production workloads, they're a really great pricing model. If you're running any SAP workloads, they're a really great pricing model. If you run, public-facing web servers, which always need to be accessible, this is a really great way to bring down your cost. They require no architecture considerations. So they're a discount mechanism only. You do not need to change your underlying infrastructure. You simply purchase the reserved instance on top, and that discount will automatically apply to any instance where there's matching capabilities. And I'll talk about that in a bit more shortly. And then finally, what type of discount do you see? So typically you see up to a 35% discount for 1 year reserved instances and up to a 75% discount for 3 year reserved instances. The second pricing model, which can offer really excellent savings, are spot instances. Now, spot instances are only available for EC2, and the best workload for spot is your stateless or fault-tolerant workloads. So if you are using auto-scaling, if you're running containers, if you're doing test and dev, if you're running any like batch jobs or analytics jobs, Spot is really, really fabulous. But the basic premise of Spot is it runs at such a high discount, at that 80 to 90% discount, because it is at excess capacity. So if you think about AWS and the infrastructure that we run, every minute of the day across all of the regions in the world, we have spare capacity. So rather than that spare capacity going to waste, we offer it to our customers on the proviso that we can take back that capacity with 2 minutes notice. So you're not going to want to run a production workload on Spot without you doing some architecting in the background. So you want to make sure that your application has been sort of designed for Spot, if you like, before you start to use it. And I think this is a really interesting point. We have a lot of customers say to us, yes, but Spot is, it's not very available, it's hard to use. And I will go into Spot in a bit more detail, but it's really interesting to note that 95% of the time, Spot instances are interrupted by the customer, not by AWS. So what does that mean? It means that customers are putting Spot into auto-scaling groups, and they have Spot for long enough to complete like the auto scale, and then they actually elect to turn the Spot instance off themselves. So there is a lot of Spot available. We also have per region, per instance, an indication of the interruption rates. So you can actually go in and look for yourself, if you're planning on running a workload on a particular instance on Spot, what's the likelihood of that instance being interrupted? So I'm going to go into each of those pricing models in a bit more detail now. Let's start with reserved instances. So the first thing to consider when considering reserved instances is what type of reserved instance makes the most sense for your organization. So you might have identified a few workloads which you want to benefit from lower pricing. And now you need to think, okay, well, what are the decision parameters that I'm making? So there are three options that you need to choose between when purchasing an RI. So the first is in terms of payment terms. So our reserved instances can either be paid for all upfront, which give you the biggest savings. They can be paid half upfront, half on an ongoing basis, which gives you a medium discount. Or in fact, you can have a no upfront reserved instance, which means that every month you commit to paying the RI, but you don't have to make any cash outlay to start with. So a great way for companies who are a little bit more cash constrained but want to save money to take advantage. The second decision that you have is how long are you willing to commit for? If you're willing to commit to a workload for 3 years, that's when you start to see the really big discounts, so sort of up to 75% discounts available. If you want to make a 1-year commitment, that's where you see discounts of about up to 35%. And then finally, and this is for EC2, you get the choice between standard or convertible. So convertibles give you plenty of flexibility if you're in the situation where you're saying, look, I know I'm going to be using EC2 for the next 1 or 3 years, but I'm not sure which instance type I'm going to be running. Or maybe I want the flexibility to change my operating system, or maybe I want the flexibility to upgrade to new instances when AWS releases them. Convertibles let you do that. So I have a table, it's got quite a lot of information, which looks at the difference between standard reserved instances and convertibles in a pretty summarized way. So when you select a standard reserved instance, there's a certain number of matching attributes that you need to make sure apply. So we talked about standard RIs being available for lots of services, and then you need to make a few choices. So you choose a particular instance family. So you might choose M4, and you choose a particular instance size. And I'll come back to this, but you choose, for example, M4 extra large, and then you get to choose your operating system. You get to choose whether it's regional or in a specific availability zone, and then if it's a shared or dedicated tenancy. Now, I just want to touch on a couple of things. A lot of people say, what's the difference between a regional RI and an AZ RI? An AZ reserved instance will actually go and reserve specific capacity for you for the duration of your reserved instance. Now, to be honest, for most customers, unless you're running massive workloads, an AZ-specific reserved instance is not normally necessary. a regional reserved instance is normally the better way to go because it applies to any instance you're running over the region. And if you're running in Linux, it also comes with instance size flexibility. So I'll go into instance size flexibility on the next page, but I just want to compare that to a convertible. Now, a convertible applies to EC2 only, but all of those parameters which we previously said you had to agree on up front, well, they're flexible. So yes, you choose an instance family to start with, and yes, you choose an instance size, and yes, you choose an operating system. But for the duration of your reserved instance, you can change those parameters as many times as you want. So we see some customers change those parameters, literally some customers change them about twice a week, whereas other customers don't change them at all. They simply like the peace of mind knowing that they can change them if they need to. So you'll see both standard and convertible instances come with instance size flexibility. What does this mean, you might ask? So firstly, it's important to note that instance size flexibility applies to EC2 for Linux operating system only. And it also applies for RDS. And you can see for RDS, it applies to MySQL and Postgres and Aurora and MariaDB, Oracle, as well as bring your own license. And we introduced instance size flexibility in response to customers saying, look, I know I'm going to be running in a particular family. Like I know I'm going to be running M4s, for example, for the next 12 or 36 months. But actually, I kind of want the flexibility to be able to scale that up or down as I need to. Like if I'm running an application which needs to upscale in the future, like what does that mean to my reserved instance? So our response was to introduce instance size flexibility, which essentially means that if you purchase an M4 extra large reserved instance in a particular region, let's say running on Linux, that discount that provides you will apply to any M4 instance in that same region. So if you're running more smaller instances, it will apply to twice as many smaller instances. If you're running a larger instance, it will apply a prorated discount to that larger instance. So essentially, it gives customers much greater peace of mind knowing that that discount will automatically apply to any instance which is running in the same family, in the same region, in EC2 for Linux, and then in RDS for most of the database options. So a frequent question we get is, well, okay, that's great, and I'm really keen to start using reserved instances, but how do I know what to purchase? So actually, RI recommendations are now available in the AWS Console. This is just a snapshot of what they look like. Let's jump into the console and see how this works in practice. So again, we're in my account, which is not the world's most exciting account. And I've come to recommendations down this toggle page on the left-hand side. And you can see here that it's giving me an estimate of what I should be doing. So it's telling me I can save $763, which is a 28% savings, and 3 purchase recommendations for EC2. And down the side, I can change it for the other services. So we saw I was running Elasticsearch. I can change it to Elasticsearch. If I try and switch it to a service, I've got a bit of RDS in there as well. So you can see it will give you recommendations for all of your services. And it really lets you toggle with the parameters to see how that impacts your savings. So for example, we talked about a 1-year RI giving you 35% savings. This is actually giving me 40% savings. If I switch that to 3 years, you can see what that does to my estimated annual savings as well as my percent savings. If I decide actually I don't want to do an all up front, I want to do a partial up front, you can see how that impacts as well. You also get the option of based on the past. So what does this mean? This means that the algorithm which is powering these recommendations will essentially take a look back in your environment over either 7, 30 or 60 days. And from how you're using your reserved instances, it will then say, okay, well, if this usage pattern continues, then this is what you should buy. So for customers who have either like a rapidly growing or shrinking environment, the best thing to do is to look back on only a 7-day period. If you've had fairly stable usage over the last month, you might want to look back over the last month. Some customers really want to understand what that usage looks like over a longer period, so they choose 60 days. And it's also great that if you want to understand what usages is covering, you can simply click the View Associated Usage, and it will take you to a screen which is saying, okay, this is the usage hours that the RI will be covering. So this is how many hours I'm currently running on demand, which will then go to a discounted model if I decide to implement that recommendation. So as with everything, there's a download CSV button here, and I want to go through what that CSV looks like, because while every recommendation on this recommendation page will save you money, the way in which this algorithm works is it aims to maximize dollar savings, whereas some customers like to think about their reserved instance in terms of how quick is my payback period, or how utilized do I expect my reserved instance to be. So this is apologies. So this is what the CSV download looks like. If you're just looking at this, it can look a little bit daunting, lots of columns, lots of data. How do we start to interpret this data to make sure we are making the best reserved instance investment decisions? So just to quickly take a look at some of these headings, you can see the recommendation date, the account. You can either look at this at a payer level or a linked level. It tells you about your instance size. It starts to look at your min and max use when it's determining your recommendation through the historic period, the operating system, so on and so forth. So I'm just going to try and make this like a little bit more readable. And don't worry, there's only a couple of columns that we're going to look at. So for the moment, I'm going to group all of these columns. I'm going to expand my projected RI utilization. I'm going to make this a bit more readable. I'm also going to group all of these columns apart from the last two. And then let's take a look at what these say. So what are we left with? We are left with a couple of things. Let me just make a couple more refinements. We are left with column K. So I highly recommend that everyone here looks at this column before making RI purchases. So this is showing me how utilized do I project my RI to be. And you can see if I sort this from largest to smallest, there's a bunch of RIs which are projected to have very high utilization. And if I keep on scrolling down, you can see that I have some RIs where even at a 75% utilization, I'm forecast to save money. But the amount of money that I'm going to be saving on that reserved instance is not going to be as high compared to my RIs, which have a very high utilization. So I might decide, actually, I'm not really interested in any reserved instance which has got, RI utilization of under 90%. And, that 90% utilization number is a number we see quite a lot of customers looking to when they're making purchasing decisions, just because they want to know that this is a reserved instance which gets used all the time. So you can see I've only selected RIs with a higher projected utilization. And then the next thing I want to look at is I want to look at my break-even month. Now, the break-even month is only applicable for your upfront and your partial upfront reserved instances. Your break-even month will always be 0 for your no upfront reserved instances, because right from day dot, you will be paying less compared to what you're paying on a monthly basis compared to on demand. But because of the upfront nature of all upfronts and partial upfronts, the break-even month is saying at what point have you fully paid off your reserve, the equivalent on-demand spend. So when you're looking at these numbers, essentially you want to find the reserved instances which have the quickest break-even month. So you want to sort this smallest to largest. You want to be making decisions saying, okay, cool, I know that actually for these instances, for example, I've paid off that reserved instance completely after 9 months compared to running on demand. You'll start to see some of the longer dated reserved instances. And if we take a look at the RIs that we've excluded for having poor utilization, you can see that you're breaking even in some cases, after 11.8 months. So you're only 0.2 of a month better off, if you like, from a reserved instance compared to on demand. So again, sort of doing a bit of a filtering process to understand where are you getting your best bang for buck will be important. And then the final consideration that customers will make is they'll take a look at the operating system. So because Linux is open source and has no licensing considerations, you see a bigger discount coming from your Linux reserved instances compared to things like Windows and Red Hat. So hopefully that gives you a useful way to start to be able to make better decisions when you look at the whole big list of RIs. Like if you're only wanting to start with a few, how do you decide which few to purchase? Like this will help you make those decisions. And again, just coming back to the console, once you have made that decision, you can start to see the impact of your investments. So if you click into your coverage report, it will show you of all of the EC2 that you have running, how much is covered by a discounted model. You can change that to any other service. You simply apply filters. You can see I've got no reserved instances for RDS. And then if you want to understand, well, how well utilized are my RIs? Again, for me, this is a demo account only, so my RIs aren't really being used. But again, in conjunction with budgets, you can say, okay, if I expect my RIs to be used 100% of the time, I want to be alerted if that changes. So if you've got any questions about RIs, please do ask one of our experts. I'll be able to take you through it in more detail. So the final 10 minutes I wanted to spend talking about Spot. So as I said to start with, Spot is our spare EC2 capacity that AWS can reclaim with 2 minutes of notice. So Spot is awesome for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's very low cost. It's up to 90% off on-demand rates. You get very fast results, so you can spin up literally thousands of instances either with the click of a button or some automation. It's easy to access, and you can have resource flexibility. What do I mean by resource flexibility? I mean that with a single API call or with a single, or maybe it's more than a single, a couple of clicks in the console, I can elect to spin up an army of Spot instances across a number of different instance types. So I can spin up a Spot fleet, which is comprised of C's and M's and R's to maximize my success in getting Spot. So here's a little bit more detail on the workloads that Spot is suitable for. We have a lot of customers who say, cool, I kind of really like the sound of Spot, but like what is good and what is bad? So just going through each set, big data. So if you're using EMR, if you're doing any batch processing, like you should absolutely be exploring putting Spot into those workloads. We see a lot of our financial institution customers do really interesting things using Spot. Like we have a number of customers who are running a lot of their Murex workloads, so very heavy but short, intensive, like big data analytic processing. And they've managed to save actually, up to 60 or 70% of their costs using Spot, because rather than running, an R5 16XL on demand, they get to run it on Spot. So they're paying like 10% of the cost. We have containers and test and dev being another really great workload. So I talked a little bit about Spot working best where you have fault tolerant workloads. A lot of customers are architecting their containers to be stateless, and they're architecting them to run sort of master-slave configurations. So it doesn't particularly matter if one of the slaves goes down. So last Friday, we actually announced Spot for auto-scaling groups, which is like a perfect workload for running Kubernetes on EC2. And because containers can be quite forgiving, so you can run like a variety of different instances and have your container running on top of that, it means that you get to choose a lot of instances to maximize your pool of Spot capacity, which raises your chance of having like a lot of Spot to bring down your cost. We also see batch processing jobs being a really great use case. If we have time, we'll jump into the console. You can actually do things like electing to run Spot only if you can get Spot for a guaranteed period of time. And we offer guaranteed Spot for up to 6 hours. So if you have flexibility around when you're processing a job, but you want it to be uninterrupted for say 3 to 4 hours, again, you can do some development to be like checking whether or not that batch capacity is available, and when it's available, you can then execute using Spot. And then finally, web services. So any auto scaling, if you're auto scaling behind a load balancer, EC2 fleet and Spot fleet let you maximize again your selection of Spot to let you scale using this low cost model. So there's a number of integrations that we offer, which makes Spot much easier to use. So it integrates into auto scaling, as I said. It integrates with AWS Batch, with EMR, with ECS. You can also integrate it into things like Terraform, with Docker. It's really popular. So it's quite funny when we look at how customers are using Spot in other regions. We see really strong adoption in the States. We see really, really strong adoption in our more price-sensitive markets like India, but actually we see very low adoption coming out of our Singapore region. But that's really great for customers that decide that they're going to start using Spot, because you can also know that you're most likely going to get really good Spot availability. So how do you get started? There are two ways. The first is through a partner. So our largest Spot partner, who's a technology company out of Israel called Spot Inst, takes the worry out of using Spot. So they will let you select the workload that you want to start experimenting with on Spot. And the way in which they've set up, they automatically balance between on-demand and Spot for you, should your Spot instance no longer be available, but you still want to carry on running that workload. So to take a very extreme example, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend this, but we actually have some customers in India who work with Spot Inst to be running SAP workloads partly on Spot, which is tremendous. The other way to get started is with AWS Labs. So we're starting to build out guidelines to help customers start experimenting with Spot. So there's a link here to using Spot Fleet behind a load balancer. There'll be a lab on using Spot with auto scaling coming out soon. I just want to show you what that lab looks like. And if anyone is going to reInvent, we will actually be doing this lab. It's pretty straightforward. It's a GitHub link, and it will tell you, what are the prerequisites, what architecture are you going to be building. It will have you deploy a CloudFormation stack, which spins up your application load balancer for you, and then it will show you how to put a Spot fleet behind those load balancers. So if you kind of want to get your hands dirty, this is a really great way to start to see how Spot instances can work for you. So that is pretty much bringing us to time. So to just recap on what we covered today, we started off by talking about how you can use our cost management tooling to better understand and control your costs. And then we moved on to how you can start using the right pricing model to lower your overall costs. So using a combination of reserved instances and Spot. I tell all my customers, the name of the game should not be to have 100% reserved instances running in your environment or 100% Spot, but actually what you want to start to do is to try and minimize the amount of on-demand that you're using where possible. So thanks very much for joining. I'm available for the next few minutes to answer any questions that you might have. And it would be awesome if you could please complete the short survey that will pop up when you exit this webinar to help us improve the quality of webinars in the future. So if there's anything more specific that you would like us to cover, if you would like more advanced topics, please feel free to let us know at that point in time. But thank you very much for your participation today.